Are you a business owner looking for real advice and input? You're in the right place. From concept to launch to growth, funding, and beyond. Welcome to Startup Hustle with your hosts. One once sold a business for $150 million. The other, the author of $1 Million Bedroom. Here are your hosts of Startup Hustle, Matt DeCoursey and Matt Watson.
1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. 'Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it.
And we're back. Another episode of Startup Hustle. Matt DeCoursey here with Patrick Price, who'll be sitting in for Matt Watson today. Patrick, what's up?
It's an honor. Doing well.
Oh, wow. You are, it's an honor to be here with you, Patrick. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. You are the founder and president of AskABookEditor.com and also the editor of all three books that I have published. You're a friend, a colleague, and someone I call occasionally for good advice. So does all of that sound accurate?
It sounds incredibly accurate, and I feel the same.
So I've had the pleasure of working with you over, a long time, gotten to know you. We've gone to Vegas together and hung out as family and different stuff. Now, one of the things that I have called you out on in the past is that you sometimes don't want to sing your own praises, which is something I specialize in. So as I wanted to write what was at the time 2 books, I realized that I knew nothing about the process and I was not an editor. I knew that Abraham Lincoln had once said that he who represents himself in court has a fool for a client. And I couldn't get that out of my head when it came to book editing. So I started looking anywhere. And if you've listened to the podcast long enough, you know we are huge proponents of finding people that are the best at what they do. And I started looking and I found Patrick. So what got my attention with him? Well, he has been the editor for multiple books with Tori Spelling, who is a multiple best-selling author of the Mommywood or Storytelling?
Storytelling was first, yeah. Number one New York Times bestseller.
And then probably what got my attention the most was the editor of He's Just Not That Into You. Which was a multi-million-dollar movie and book franchise. You've worked with Tim Gunn. You were the author of Sippy Cups Are Not for Chardonnay, which
I was
is one of
the editor of. Yes.
Involved in and all of it, but
Exactly.
Done everything. Lance Bass, all kinds of people, but you specialized in what is known as narrative nonfiction. So at the time that I met you, you were just becoming an entrepreneur on your own, and you're the guy now. So if you want to learn more about what Patrick does and check some stuff out while we're talking about this or later, just go to askabookededitor.com and you'll see all kinds of great stuff in there. So Patrick, welcome to Startup Hustle.
Thank you so much. No, it was a great meeting. I think the stuff that you learned, I also learned things. So it was like a perfect meeting of the minds. The stuff that instinctively, I got to absorb, and stuff that I thought, was just instinctive, I could then teach you. So it's been a good friendship, but also a good working relationship as well.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of that. For those of you that listen regularly, you know that I have quoted Patrick a lot. Patrick taught me many things: how to not take my voice out of my own writing, how to understand you have to lead with a need, and also the importance of brevity. Yeah. So now, Patrick, you're in Brooklyn. That's where you reside. You have a history. Let's start with your backstory. So give us a little background about yourself as a book editor before we get into some of the stuff that people might be interested about, or some of the things people might want to ask a book editor.
Yeah, sure. I've been in the publishing industry for about 25 years now. Probably about 20 years at 2 of the biggest publishers in the world, at Random House, and for many years at Simon & Schuster. Worked in different sort of areas, originally as a publicist, then I worked for a literary agent, and then really found my perfect sweet spot as an editor, which I also do some writing too, so it all kind of wove in together. From that, I I've really worked on all sorts of genres, but like you said, I think the area that I seem to be most drawn toward is what they call narrative nonfiction and also prescriptive nonfiction. And I can explain those if you want, but yeah, it's basically written in sort of like almost a fiction-ish, looser style, but prescriptive. You're learning something, and narrative, you can still be learning something, but it also can kind of be a little bit more memoir and stuff like that. But then really after that, I decided to go out on my own, get to pick my own projects, get to work with, I've always worked with a lot of first-time authors, whether they go on to write New York Times bestsellers or they just really go on to create what they've always wanted to do. And so really about 2.5 years ago or so, I kind of actually sort of more branded myself as the Ask a Book editor, and to make it both for clients, but also kind of a really good sort of resource spot. So I can kind of share various knowledge and stuff that would be of interest to people as they consider doing a book or discover, the various challenges and pitfalls along the way.
And there are quite a few pitfalls along the way. There's a lot to understand. Now, I don't know if everyone knows this, but Amazon sells 5 out of 6 books right now.
Yeah.
83%. And that's both digital or paperback. Another interesting thing that many don't realize is so many of the books that you buy on Amazon, they print one at a time as you order them, which is crazy because they get them to you 2 days later. So we learned some of this stuff. Some of it was knowledge that was already there, and we were fascinated with some of it as we tried to create a process, knowing that we would write several books. So let's talk a little bit about independent publishing versus traditional publishing. So you have Random House and Simon & Schuster are like the New York Yankees and New England Patriots of publishing.
Correct.
Those are the big kids, right? So you go from that to here you are, you're being your own independent entity. What's your take on the indie publishing versus traditional publishing? Just pros and cons.
I mean, the pro is that indie publishing now is definitely a very viable option, and it really wasn't 10 years ago. I mean, it's increasingly more and more and more. Because with the pro over traditional publishing would be, you have a full team that's behind you. So if you're doing indie publishing, it's either you or you then have to find your team to create the work. You also will have hopefully an advance. So there's the difference between, it's a contract. And so you'll get, they're investing in you as opposed to you're sort of investing into your own future. And then really the main thing used to be everybody's like, well, I want to do traditional publishing because I want to be in a bookstore. So sadly, there's not as many bookstores now, and your book might make it into some of the bookstores, but it'll be like maybe one copy somewhere. It's like, even pretty big books, the general orders are lower. And when you also traditionally publish, if you're thus lucky to get a contract, get your book in the bookstore, have support behind it, then you really have a pretty small window of when they're able to kind of focus on it marketing wise, and to have there's a limited amount of table or shelf space. So if your book basically doesn't fly out of the gate, and even if it does, they're kind of like, yay, but it doesn't mean there'll be like millions right after it. Your window is small. Whereas with indie, especially if it is ebook and print on demand, I mean, it's kind of evergreen. It's always there. It doesn't, and it's not like in the old days where if you did do an indie publishing, you might have to like buy thousands of copies of your book and somehow hide them in your closet or in the back of your car trunk or something. And now there's the beauty of, you're not paying for all these extra books until they're needed. And but it's really leveled the playing field a lot.
Well, so many of the top selling books that come out are indie publishers now. Like you see a good portion of them, and And let's talk about the financial side of it, because when you own the copy, meaning like it's not owned by a publisher,
Right.
if you can get some traction behind that, you're going to keep the lion's share of the revenue. Now, Amazon they take a royalty and they charge you to print the books or do some form of it, but there's a significant upside if, and I key the word if, you can promote and get some traction behind your own copy.
Yes. That, definitely the finance things. I mean, if your book takes off, you're in a much more advantageous position as far as royalties and the amount of time. You're not on a royalty payment schedule, which your book could do very well traditionally. And I'm 100% not anti-traditional. I mean, it's where I'm from and it's amazing. But the one thing is, like, your book depends on kind of what your time frame is. Like, if you sell your book, it really, unless it's an absolute crash, which is kind of unheard of, unless you've found the COVID solution and with an antidote, and you're going to publish that, and then they'll put it out tomorrow. But beyond that, really, any book will take at least a year, sometimes 18 months or so to come out. And even if your book does sell well, I mean, there is a royalty schedule, so you may not see, money until years later, and it has to earn back
Or
its
ever.
advance, or ever. Yeah, because
Right.
the publishing industry essentially survives. I mean, it's all publishing is a little bit of a gamble, and the publishing industry survives on the massive success of a very small number of titles that keep the lights on and make up for everything else.
Some of the books that are in the categories that I published in, some of those top 50 are still there from 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is really kind of proving that point. And there are so many books. I can't remember. I should have looked this up, and I'm guilty of not doing this. But what did we learn? That there was over 1 million new books come out every year.
Right.
And think about that piled on to the history of literature, and that's your competition.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get lost. And, there's so many books don't ever sell a copy, or they don't sell copies to people that are readers or family.
Correct.
That was, and some sell tons. So there's an interesting equilibrium there. Now,
there's the equilibrium, but there's also, also with traditional publishers, when they decide that they're interested in acquiring a book, they run their profit and loss sheet, and it's a little bit of voodoo. And they look and see what the comparative titles are, how well it's done, how well they think that this kind of can compare to that, and they come up with a projection, and then usually they hit like 20% of that. But they try that.
Sounds like startups.
Exactly, it's true. But oftentimes, one of the other differences between indie and traditional is that at traditional publishing, the anticipated bar is so much higher of what they think they have to sell in order to. I mean, they're not really in the business of. I mean, it depends on how big the publisher is, but they're not going to give like teeny tiny advance for a book they think will do kind of good, but not that great. But so they're always kind of hoping to hit much higher. So the bar is higher. Whereas with indie publishing, sometimes people have really great ideas or have something that maybe is very targeted, and there's clearly an audience to it. And it's really like perhaps you as the expert or the specialist know that type of marketing and know how to reach those particular people. And, sometimes it does, come around. I mean, the books like, like Twilight, it's fiction, but Twilight and the 50 Shades of Grey and all that stuff. I mean, that was the reverse, where people did their indie publishing, and then so many people caught on that the traditional was like, oh, okay, there's actually a market for this. And they published it. But it evens the playing field in many, many ways.
I think a lot of authors are writing books to create a platform and establish themselves as thought leaders. I was in that category. I acknowledged right away. I said, I don't think I'm probably going to profit from sales of the book. But that said, I I had a story that I wanted to tell. I had two different stories I wanted to tell. They were very different. One was a little more self-help oriented. The other was a story of myself as an entrepreneur, which I might have to write a follow-up to, because 2.5 years later, that's like we kind of left $1 Million Bedroom a little unresolved. Like,
Right.
we'll see what happens. And wow, I mean, those same people turned into a completely different company and 200 employees in less than 2 years, and you never know where it happens. But I think that, and I've had so many people ask me, like, do you make a lot of money off selling your books? I'm like, fuck no. I do not. I've given away more than I've sold, and we've sold a fair amount. I don't want to downplay the work and what we created, but I mean, that's something we've given away a lot. We give away copies of $1 Million Bedroom when Full Scale does events and send them to clients. And
there are different types of value.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
I mean, the value, like you said, with your platform, your expertise. When you write a book that is like a legit book, I mean, it is. I mean legit. I don't mean traditional. I mean that it's not like, you know, you sat there and you Xerox something. Then you really do. It elevates you, and you become. People say, like, "Well, I'm not an expert." I'm like, "Well, you are now." And in most people's eyes, when you've written a book and it looks, I mean, for all it. You know, it's well written, it's edited, it has a nice cover on it, and you truly have something to say, then guess what? You're an author and you're an expert. And for most public perception, I mean, that's a huge thing to get. And it really does kind of elevate you in whatever field that you're in or whatever your particular expertise is.
Right. You taught me, and I learned working with you, writing a book's a lot harder than I thought it would have been.
Oh,
like, there are so many more steps and different types of editors and things, and just so much to consider. I look back, and one of the things was when we were getting ready to publish Balance Me, and I had a potential cover, and I showed it to you, and you're like, I hate it. And I was like, why? You're like, well, first off, shrink it down to the size of a thumbnail and tell me you can even tell what the title is. And I did that, and I knew I was immediately wrong. I was like, wow, okay. So, and that was great advice. I've actually passed that advice on to other people, because as an author, people have asked me for input on their cover or whatever. I'm like, shrink it down to a thumbnail. Another thing, it had a hand on it. And you told me in the industry, we never put a hand on a cover. And I was like, hey, that's enough. You got me at thumbnail, man. Don't rub it in.
It's true, because you think about, I mean, you've seen a bunch of books, but we've seen so many books, you know, whether it's books that are published by others, by ourselves, all the things that have come our way from agents that we're like, for whatever reason, no, or, you know, we know what's worked, what hasn't worked. I mean, it's a very opinionated field, but it comes from a place of pretty much just like sharing. I mean, an author is, of course, like, this is their baby, and they've spent so much time on it, and it's you have to find, obviously, an editor and other people that you trust, and you know, you still have the final say. But I would say it's always important at least to listen, because no one's like giving you advice that are just trying to like screw you over. They're really trying to be like, in my opinion, you know, my kind of quote unquote expert opinion, here's how I think you might be sabotaging yourself, or here's a way that we could really boost your book. I mean, that was
one of the things I said to you right away. The rule of yes.
Oh,
if
yeah.
you think I'm going to say yes 90% of the time, just do it, because I'll deal with the 10% of the time that you're wrong. But I could tell that some past experience with more finicky authors had probably been present. And, you know, much like musicians or anyone else, there's a lot of pride in work. Sometimes people don't take feedback. It was like I mentioned with the thumbnail instance.
Right.
I shrunk that thing down to a thumbnail. I knew immediately. I was like, wow, I just wasted money having someone design this. And we found some people that had a little more relevant experience with that. And you mentioned the whole, like, does the book look real? Does it feel real? That was important to us during the process. We wanted it to be polished, to not be garbage. That took time.
Right.
I think one of the things I underestimated, and so much of that transforms throughout the process. You know, much like any other startup, writing a book follows a similar process.
Definitely.
And that begins with determining if an idea is marketable. How do you do that? Because we talked about that. That was over 3 years ago. So I don't remember every part of it, but we had talked about the category and the different stuff. We knew who we were going to compete with. That didn't dissuade me from wanting to write either title, but for someone listening, how do you know if your book is even marketable?
Well, first you have to ask yourself, like, who is the audience for this book? And I hope it's like past your mom or your spouse. You have to go beyond that. And what is it fulfilling? That's what kind of, like you said, what's the need that a reader is going to get out of it? Like what's drawing them toward them, that you're delivering something. And then you really have to look and see kind of what else is there. Make sure you're really having something unique to say. Obviously, if it's your story is always going to have elements in it that are unique. But that's like gives you a decent clue. I mean, if someone's never ever done anything even close to what you're doing, then there's a chance that you might be brilliant and onto something,
which is rare.
Is rare. Or you might need to kind of skew it. I remember one thing, I don't remember the exact specific thing, but sometimes with an author and with an editor, kind of like with the cover and stuff too, is that not that the editor is like always right, but if something really sticks out to the editor for whatever reason, whether this title's wrong or this cover's wrong or this is not said right or we should start here or blah blah blah, usually they're on to something. But sometimes it's when you point that out together and or just the author, like there may be an alternate solution, but it is kind of this give and take, and it's not always like do it this way and that's the way because I said so, but it's more like this is why this isn't working and you understand why, and then oftentimes the new solution is the ideal solution that you kind of reach mutually or whatnot. But yeah, marketing that's the $1 million question. But it's like if you tell other people about it, are they excited about it? Are you excited to work? Because like you said, writing a book is hard. It's definitely doesn't have to be elitist or unachievable. But another way to know if something is marketable is you have an idea, but now let's break it down. And can you take this idea? Is this like an interesting thought or like a nice little essay you can write, or is it a book? And if it's a book, you have to be able to imagine a table of contents or everybody has different methods of how they break down their book, but essentially, what is the outline of this book? Where is it going? How is it starting? And where is it going to ultimately lead to? And if you find that you really have nothing to say or nothing more than 20 pages to say, then it's not marketable, because it's not a book. But that's sort of the truth comes out sometimes there. But other times you have this idea and then you start breaking it down and you realize just how rich it is. And it's like, oh, I didn't think I could explore this sort of angle and this angle. And that's where it becomes even larger. I mean, I think of being, I just had this random idea the other day. I was like, I kind of think of being an editor as kind of like an archaeologist at times. And it's like, you're finding this story or this book within this mass of pages. And sometimes you got to bring out like the shovels and the heavy equipment and you're just like, we're going to find something. And other times you have to bring out the little teeny brush and you're like, we're just fine tuning it here. And other times it's like, you know what, we're not finding anything here, but I think actually the site is over here, and that's, so it's, I don't know. That metaphor fully works.
Well, we went through some of that. We went through a lot of that with $1 Million Bedroom, and that book came out of me pretty quickly because it was just it's easy to write about something you've experienced. Like your story is your story, and it came pouring out. You definitely unleashed the content demon from Title 1 to Title 2, and I learned a lot of things. The main thing is if you're going to hire an editor and you don't spend your time as a writer looking in the rearview mirror. Yes. I actually sent you a first draft with an apology note. At one point, it wasn't the first one, but that has a lot to do with it. One of the things that I think well, Patrick, I'll say none of these 3 books would have probably come out, and they certainly wouldn't have been the quality that they were without you. But one of the things that using Patrick, and go to askabookeditor.com if you want to find Patrick. You can also find a link in the show notes. And by the way, I should probably mention in the 24th minute that today's episode of Startup Hustle is brought to you by Fullscale.io, helping you build a software team quickly and affordably. I'm only 22 minutes late on that one. I'm doing a great job. I was just excited to hear from you, Patrick.
Oh, thank you.
Back to the topic here, you saved me a lot of frustration. At one point, one of the memorable things I remember, though, was also there's a great editor does more, and we'll talk in a few about the different types of editors, but you're a little more than an editor because you gave me confidence in some places where I needed it. And you told me in certain cases, I remember when I interviewed, and I'm like, I need someone that's going to tell me if it sucks.
Right.
Like, are you going to be afraid to tell me that it's dog shit? Because if you are, then you're not the right person for this. And, but the hours of frustration, I remember in the first title, I was trying to take my voice out of it. And you literally kind of smacked me around virtually. You're like, dude, your voice is in this writing. There are writers that try forever to find their quote voice, and you're trying to get rid of it. Stop doing that. And that was that, because I didn't have a lot of confidence. I have never really considered myself to be a writer in that regard. But how are some other ways that you save people, save your clients huge? Like, what are the frustrating things that you consistently help people get over?
Well, the voice is definitely a huge thing. It's when people are like, I'm going to be a writer, so now I have to get like in fancy writer mode. And that's when suddenly like their vocabulary is like, I'm like, no, like no one, like how you read should be how you talk. I mean, you don't need all the, it's not full on conversational. It is, a little magic done to make it smooth. But you definitely don't have to like sound super pretentious or just not like yourself. That's like a red flag. The other thing is really just to like, a lot of times people, especially with whenever it has like the prescriptive part of it, which means, they're being an expert, is they don't feel like they're qualified. And then they like they don't like, you need to, if you don't come out of the gate and just own your expertise and own your advice, and it's freely like, you're not giving medical advice. You're not like, there's no harm that's going to be done. You just really have to be authentic. And it's like almost like thinking of it as like you're in a debate club. Like you have to win me over to like, to trust you and that you know what you're talking about. So if you start trying to overqualify everything or be like what I said is kind of true because here's 800 studies and stuff. He's like, no one, I mean, there's an audience. I mean, that's an academic book. That's different. But you just you're building trust with the reader. So you have to kind of first build trust with your own voice and your own confidence that you have something to say. And knowing that your editor, like when you do go off track a little bit or meanders, like they will save you. They will be like, no, we don't need this part, or let's move it here, or we could just kind of collapse some of this stuff to make it make more sense. Did you find, I don't know, it was really like the first thing with like sometimes people have tough time writing and talking it out sometimes works. Some writers can just sit down and do the keyboard, and other people it can help to use like transcription type things, but you just have to know that
book 1, yes, book 2, no, and book 3 the same. But I had to learn, like you helped me get past that. Like I said,
I think that's best when you can get
you licensed me to use my own voice, and the feedback that I get from and then there was a different dynamic because book 3 was co-authored, and that was once again back to that. So how do we do this? Who's talking in the book? And you said, no, you need a universal voice here.
Yep.
Let the reader figure that out. Imagine whomever. And I probably the greatest, the common point that I heard the most, other than your book holds my coffee table up really well, is people saying that they heard my voice in it. And that was what made it what they often referred to as a quick read.
Yep.
Which
quick
is what you want. What you want.
Is the best, the best compliment you can get. I mean, what I worked on personally, I mean, people have different types of tastes, but what I'm drawn toward, and what I think a lot of commercial readers are drawn toward, is this little bit of sense of intimacy. Like it has this sense that you're just having a talk with your friend, or your best friend that tells you the truth. So I loved, to me, nothing made me happier than doing a book or a memoir, whether it was Tori's or whoever's, where someone would say, obviously, it wasn't like it was short, but it wasn't like a 900-page book, but anyone that would say, I read this book, I couldn't put it down, and I read it from a cross-country trip and in one session. And to me, that is the highest compliment, because you made this connection. It was making writing look effortless and making your voice sound effortless, is one of the biggest gifts you could do. Anyone can make something seem overly complicated and stuff. That to me, that's not skill. That's just verbiage, And but yeah, it is having that sort of one-on-one conversation. And I love books that it's really more about, it's either like it's I, and when it's two authors, as much as possible, it is a sort of collective we, but you never forget that you're talking to you, the reader, and that's, to me, it's the difference. I would say it's, if you're doing some types of books, it's the difference between teaching someone or sharing something with someone. What's more interesting? Someone sharing it to you, because you're sharing a story.
It's like knowledge transfer from a village elder compared to like, here's a textbook that's like
no one wants a lecture.
And blah, and and don't be afraid to tell it like it is.
Yeah.
I always remember might not be an exact quote. Got to keep it moving. It's slowing down here. We got to keep it moving. So
sounds right.
And I get that. As someone with a raging case of ADHD, I appreciated that, because if you bore me, I'm out.
Yep.
I'm out. If it begins to lag, and you were really emphatic about that, because and balance me.
Mm-hmm.
That has so many, and that's about finding balance within your personal, professional, and physical life. Right. You taught me as well to do certain things, like we disarmed the reader immediately. Well, first off, if you don't think you're part of if you're not your own biggest problem, put the book down, because you're not going to like it.
Yep.
And then also you're going to find parts of this book to be spot on about you, and some might not be. Skip those parts.
Yep.
So, and it's amazing how you give a reader a license to do that, and then they'll actually do it. If not, they might get stuck in a part that's not applicable to them, and then they're bored, and then they move on.
One thing I say, I don't know if I tortured you with the whole punch up the ending.
You probably did.
I'm sure I did, and especially like the end of a section or the end of a chapter.
Punch it up and make it transition into the next one.
Make it transition to the next, or it's sometimes writing is about a beat. It's a rhythm, and it's ending on the right note, whether that's leading into something or it's like adding some kind of insight or something interesting. I always say, like, don't make it too easy. Don't make it easy for someone to stick a bookmark in it, where it's just like, and this part is done.
Example could be something like, well, and that was a wild ride to get to that we just described. The crazy thing is it got even wilder.
Exactly.
And that's like how you would end. That's how we would end a chapter. And that would make me at least want to turn that page to be like, what the hell are they talking about?
Yeah.
Some of it
doesn't have to be a full suspense thriller, but there is just that something that's basically like, you need to keep reading because there's more and it's interesting.
Okay. Next.
Yes.
Do you have to be a great writer to write a great book?
Yeah.
He doesn't want to answer. I'm going to answer first. That was a dual question. No, you don't. Yeah. You need a great editor. Yeah. You need a great editor. Like it's the key. It's the key.
And you also need to write a really good book. Some people are like, this isn't great. This is going to be one for the canon. But if it's a really good book where you're delivering what you've promised, the reader is going to get something out of it. then yeah, every book, even like the best writers in the world, like they all need an editor. They all need a reader. I mean, an editor is kind of like the ideal reader, or the first reader, or the reader that's allowed to kind of like cross out stuff, but yeah, I mean, everyone, there are different degrees of skills and needs. And sometimes people need a word by word kind of help. And other times they just need like bigger picture stuff, which can make it's like with you, like finding your voice, like it's things like that just unlock something, so you don't have to be a great writer. You have to be a hard worker. You have to like realize that this is a commitment, and it's not going to just automatically write itself. And it's not always fun, but it is worth it. And you will find joy and excitement along the way. And there's nothing better than when it's all done, reading your work and being like, damn, I wrote this.
I was about to say, the best part about writing a book is finishing it.
Yeah.
I mean, and I can't relate because I'm not female, but I would imagine it's similar to getting that baby out after 9 months. You're like, get out, like I just do something different. And the reason you need an editor you need multiple. And I want to talk about that in a second because that's something I didn't realize. But you get so close to these projects that you are not objective.
Right.
And that includes you sometimes as an editor. And we talked about that because you warned me about that up front. You said, look, I think a lot of people think that you get an editor and you got it all, but we're going to get so close to this, we're going to need a couple different types of editors. Let's talk about that for a second, because I don't think most people even realize that there are different types of editors. So
there's different types of editors, which we can talk about, but there's also, it depends if you are preparing something that you want to then, send out to publish, to a traditional publisher, but especially if you're planning to see this through publication, then there's definitely other people that need to come in at different steps along the way. So you mean like copy editors that we were talking about, or developmental?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, all of it. I mean, that's the thing. There's different shades here.
And, totally.
And you were able to cover a few of them, and then there was a few you told me, and I'll let you describe what a copy editor does. You said, Matt, if you want this book to feel polished, then this is what we need. And that was a high thing on my list. And then the same thing with developmental, though, because I think that I've given advice to a few people. I said, get an editor early, because that developmental side of it can shape the way the whole creative and just the whole production line, the way it's laid out and the way you approach it.
There's a lot of, to make it more confusing, as there's a lot of semantics and not and not uniform descriptions of some of this stuff. So, I sometimes am like, I know what you're saying, but if this is brand new to you, like, I'll give you a quick little primer. Basically, they boil it down to two or three types of like editing things, or editing types of assignments. One is, they'll talk about content editing, or sometimes they'll call it line editing. And that is literally like the editor that reads, they'll always be reading, but are looking at it word for word for word, finding things like, oh, your dog was a boy in the beginning and suddenly he's a female dog on this other page. Like they're finding the discrepancies, but they're also like literally fine tuning your words and helping you, they're doing the nitty gritty. And then,
by the way, that's the worst job in the world.
It kind of is.
I determined after seeing that and watching you'll get the two editors will then debate.
Oh God!
Just to make sure they talk it out. And I remember I completely excluded myself from. I was like, hey, let me know what y'all come up with, because this is not my thing.
You're like, I'm leaving the playground for now. You guys fight it out.
For like, I'll be at 5 playgrounds over, but that proves the point. My book would have been freaking terrible if I didn't have different editors in there. There are so many people that are trained to do that, and people that actually have the attention span and focus to be that absorbed in what you've created. Yeah,
that's all right. So, kind of looping back, a developmental editor, and the way I work to make it more confusing is I often lump I'm sort of all in. But anyway, developmental editor looks at the big picture, and it's kind of like, is this a marketable idea? Are you explaining it the right way? Is your voice right? Is the format right? How is it organized? Like they're looking at it. They're a little more macro, but it's important because sometimes books need like an overhaul at that stage. Other times they can kind of work that they're keeping all that in mind, but it's not so like. Sometimes a development edit is like, okay, you've gone on a different path, go back. Like there's no point to start doing the line edit or the content edit or whatever until you fix these big things, because otherwise you're going to do it all over again and it doesn't make sense. So there's that. The beauty of my thing in general is sometimes you definitely need to do just that. Sometimes the people they say like an editorial assessment. That's kind of using more of the developmental editor's hat. They're looking at your book and they're kind of saying like in bigger pictures, what's working, what's not working, what could be tightened, but they're not really looking at it on a line by line kind of basis. I definitely usually come in where I think that there's something there, because if you're just creating it out of absolute air, it's a nightmare. But in general, that there is something there. You're making it the best it can be, and then seeing it through really that your big picture stuff is then applied into the little details. Now, what a copy editor does, and there is overlap as well, is the copy editor is like the super, super anal retentive. I mean, editors are anal retentive, but the copy editor is the ones that they're the grammar police. Like, I mean, God bless them. Like I always say, and I'm sure I told you and stuff, is like, look, I understand like publishing also has like, they follow Chicago Manual of Style. So there's things that just seem like arbitrary, but I'm like, no, this is how we do, how we format whatever. This is how you do a percentage. This is how you do a title versus is it italicized or is it underlined or is it in bold and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. So I can weigh in on that, but they definitely like are super trained in that stuff. They're like the equivalent of like the librarian of the process, And so they look in there and they understand grammar inside and out. I've got a pretty good knowledge of it and I fix a lot of it, but in the end, I will always say, they will find something that you and I haven't found, because that's what they specialize in. And they're great. And like you said, also, they're a fresh eye, because we might have seen something so many times that we've gotten blind to something, whether it's an error, a typo, or just something like we like redid some section so many times that there's like a sentence that just like stops or something, that we just missed. So they are.
You will hate your book. You will hate your own book before it comes out.
It's true.
I feel that that's a natural part, and I think it's probably not ready until you hate it at some point.
Yeah.
Like, and that I see that with startup founders a lot. That when are we going to do our first release? Some of the richest, most successful people in the history of startups say if you don't look back at your first release with absolute terror, then you hung on to it for too long. Now, books are a little different. One thing for those of you that are writing books or getting into that, it's really easy to change things later. Like they don't print a semi-truckload of them when you're doing an indie publisher. Like I could literally make an edit to the ebook on any of these things, or actually the printed version, and it would take Amazon maybe 24 hours to process those changes, and then every book they would make going forward, they would change. Now, I say that to inspire confidence in some people, meaning in the past, it would have been written in stone. You do have the ability to make some subtle changes. Now, that doesn't mean that you should be sloppy and do different stuff. But I think so many people think that, all right, so when a musician puts out an album, they don't go back and update the song later. That's part of the advantage of modern publishing is your ability to change and modify some things. It shouldn't be your form of editing, but if you're completely freaked out about publishing it because it will forever be written in stone, I mean, if it makes you feel better, it's not.
Matt, related to that, because I know you're an expert in many ways of this particular type of subject. I 100% agree with that. And part of it is like, there is a point where you have to let it go. I mean, get it proofread, get it copy edited and everything. But, you've told your tale. You don't need to tell it in some sort of different way. And yes, you can always, upload a new file. Do you know, maybe this is getting too technical here, but about when publishers do that, they often do it. Well, they actually can make changes, and then there's different editions. But I believe usually the ebook or print on demand is always kind of like a first edition in a way, So if you do make super changes, have Kindle and Amazon change their stuff all the time? But I'm curious. I thought I heard somewhere that they said that it might does it affect your rankings? Like, is it like a new book?
I haven't had any experience with that, but I don't spend a whole lot of time in there, and I actually haven't changed any of the copy in any books. So it could. As far as the actual rankings go, I doubt it, but it could change some forms of history. I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Yeah, because it's when you publish it, it's sort of seen as like, I think that to get around that, you can make changes, and there's really no reason. Even if it changed something, you would want it to be corrected anyway. But I would think that the flip side is that even though you're super excited, it's so close, like, don't rush it, because it's best to just attempt to get a couple of different eyes, the proofreader and stuff. So when you hit publish, something will be found at some point. And honestly, traditional publishers, I could read books from Simon Schuster or Random House, and I'll still occasionally be like, oh, here's a typo, because it's human beings are still working on these books, so they make mistakes, and it's not.
You got to hit the who cares button at some point, though. Like if you're striving for perfection, you're never going to find it, which was part of the point. I'll give you an example. So in the Realist Guide to a Successful Music Career that I wrote with Joel Cummins, we talked a couple weeks ago and had a legit discussion as to whether or not we should add a chapter, because the music industry and musicians have been so deeply impacted by all the COVID-19 coronavirus stuff. It's like a whole different world for musicians. And so how do you get past it? And the whole purpose of the book was to create something useful for musicians going forward. So what do they do? How do you handle that? And that's something that we said, maybe started sitting back and saying, well, how much work would that take? And then the main problem is in a situation as fluid as some of that is, okay, yesterday Kansas had social distancing rules. Today they've removed all of them.
Right.
So how do you write something that is relevant and not, with that particular title, we wanted to, as we looked at the marketability and everything else involved before we wrote it, we said, what's the shelf life of this? How long is this book going to be relevant before it's obsolete? And it actually had a fairly long shelf life compared to other stuff. But yeah, we kind of paused at the point where we said, do you have all the answers? No, I don't either. So, okay, well, it'd be kind of hard to be an authority on the topic.
But you could also use that as like a marketing angle. Like, it's not new in the book, but it is something that, as the authors, the experts of that topic, if there was a reason or publicity thing or something that could come up, then you could use that as the topical discussion, and that plugs the book, but isn't necessarily. Anytime you try to be crazy timely in the book, it will become crazy dated soon. So it's.
Yeah, and I agree. That's something we strive for on the podcast too. Is it's easy to say, oh, well, we're recording this on a Thursday, and then it comes out on a Tuesday, and it just doesn't. And it doesn't. What facts, what things, what kind of stuff are relevant and matter? There's, I don't know, so many things change.
The best book are the thing they call perennials. If you're a perennial book, that's like the bread and butter of publishing too. It's a book that things don't change too much, and it becomes the go-to for that. This is not the best example in the world, but my God, that like all the places you can go. I think people, your great grandkids will get that for graduation. It's like, the Dr. Seuss thing. Yeah, that book. But the types of thing is if you stay with your own experience or like the human experience in that sense, then you found kind of something more timeless that people can come back to.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound negative or like a hater, but the chances that your book is going to become like what Patrick just mentioned are almost none. It doesn't mean you shouldn't write one. For me, that was something I always wanted to do. So I apparently did 3 of them. I've had a lot of people ask me a lot of interesting questions. I'm sure you get this way, way, way more than I do. But I think one of the things that I've run into more than anything else is people want to tell me about a book that they want to write, that they've been thinking of, that blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, how far are you in it? Well, I haven't started yet.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how long have you been sitting on this? 12 years. What do you think I need to do to get started? I think you need to go home and write something.
100%.
Like anything. So what advice do you give for people that have wanted to write a book and have yet to either do it or succeed or whatever?
It's that button chair time. You have to just sit and do it, because the sad thing is, if you have a really great idea, and let's say it is a great idea, but you sit on it for years, then when you're going to finally get around to doing it, it's not going to be so great, because that idea, I do think of thoughts and inspiration as kind of like, they visit you, they hang out, they get you excited. And at a certain point, if you're just talking about it, it just goes away. It is there. So I often would give the advice that it's better to work on. I mean, if you have like 1 or 2 trusted people that you want to talk to something about, but if this is your like constant, banter with everyone with this great idea that you have, but you're not doing it, you're never going to do it, because talking about it is 6 million times easier than working on it. But if you sit down and start working on it, then I think you're going to find out, like, be realistic. Like, don't think that it's going to just come, like we talked about before, like just like flowing out and amazing. But if you're there and you see that this is a good idea and you're working on it, then you're proving it, and you can excitedly tell everybody about it much further along the process, especially if you can be like, and you can buy this book. But yeah, all talk, it doesn't translate, and people just basically tune that out, and you don't get that same, whether the book is great or not. If you've seen it through, then you get some serious respect for that. So that's what I would encourage.
Once again with us today, Patrick Price, the founder and president of askabookeditor.com, a guy who has written a lot of books with a lot of fun and interesting people. We usually end episodes with what we call the Founders Freestyle, but I'd instead like to hear a story that you might have, something fun or interesting or whatever, about one of your past experiences with an editor or a book. And maybe I can bait you. Maybe I can bait you because, let's talk about the one that was the most well known.
Okay.
He's just not that into you. Didn't you say that had been rejected a bunch?
Okay. Yes, that had been rejected probably at least a dozen times by the publishers. It came to me. It was actually a little more of like a joke book in a sense. I mean, it was less of an advice book and more of just like a one kind of joke. And yes, it does still have one sort of thought and stuff, but I read this and I love the humor. I love the voice. I like the whole concept. I knew about, where it kind of originated from the Sex and the City episode. And as an editor, I didn't judge it on just what was there. I judged it on what it could be. And that's sort of where the developmental editor kind of popped in, I guess. And I said, you know what, this is bigger, but this isn't a joke book. This is actually a manual. And yes, it's repetitive, but it's repetitive because we need to repeat this to beat it into your head, so you actually will accept it. And got incredibly excited, bought it. You'd be shocked for its success. It was a perfectly lovely deal, but after 58 weeks and bestseller list and 9 at number 1 and 40, I don't know what it was, various foreign publishers.
$178 million at the box office when it became a movie later.
Yeah.
I think the last time I checked, it was close to 3 million copies sold.
And there are not that many books from a little bit ago that that. So whether it's the movie or the book or both, but people, it's fun to be part of something that everybody's like, oh, I get it. Like, I don't read much, but I have heard of Da Vinci Code. It's like things like that is cool. But what other random story, which I'm sure the book might have done a little differently?
Well, I think the thing that was important there is, look, this is a book that became a franchise.
Yep.
And it had been rejected. Like, no.
Mm-hmm.
How often do we hear this story on Startup Hustle, talking to founders that were pitching their idea, trying to get it funded? How many no's do you have to get through to hear a yes? Or find someone, in Patrick's case, it's I love this concept. We have something here. It's not where it needs to be, but I have some belief that this can be something big. And if the author or any of this had said, you know what, after 10 no's, I'm out, how different would that person's life be? So I think the question comes down to just, and I don't think we need another story. I think that one was perfect. Because think about that. I mean, $178 million at the box office, huge sales. Like, it's very well known. Everyone's heard of the book and the movie, or one of them, or both. And that's what you're trying to do. So you never know. If you have belief in it, if that person had given up, and then they also, the writer, I'm assuming, because there were some changes that were made too. Wasn't it written from one perspective, and
it's two perspectives. There's a female that kind of weighs in, but there's co-writers, Liz Tuccillo and Greg Barrett. But the novelty of it, of course, is that it was sort of written from like a big brother point of view that was, trying to like steer you in the right way. And then Liz would bring in the truthful, sort of like the women's perspective. But I think it's also a case of knowing your audience. And if someone's like, oh, that's too mean or whatever, it's like, no, this is a reality that people are going through, and that it does connect, and there's a need, and it's providing an answer. It's also providing entertainment, which is, I think it's also nice to often have woven into books. Don't be scared of a little bit of a sense of humor. Your editor will tell you if your joke bombs, or goes too far, but overall it's just adding, it's not taking yourself too seriously. But he's not saying that based on his experience with me. Not at all.
Well, once again with us today, Patrick Price, CEO, founder, president, the guy at askabookeditor.com. If you want to write a book, you need to consult with Patrick. He's amazing. I say that not only from my own experience. My co-author, Joel Cummins, in the last book, had a great time working with Patrick. He's not afraid to tell you what's up. And sometimes that's what we need. I think I want to close out by saying, if you want to write a book, you need to just sit down and start doing it. One of the things that I learned from book 1 to 2 to 3 was you need to just try to get as much of it out of you as possible. The more time you spend looking in the rearview mirror, the less time you have to see what's coming down the road and what's ahead of you. It makes for sloppy copy the first time through, but if you have editors and that process and you get all that, well, then you clean it up. So Patrick will hate me for saying this, but sometimes you just send your editor an apology note with your first draft. But it's like we were saying with the person that hadn't written a book for 12 years. Nike says it best. Just do it. Sit down. Like, the worst case scenario is no one will ever see it, and you throw it away. So speaking of which, I think I'm going to throw away the copy of my 4th book. So I got to get moving. But thanks for joining us today, Patrick.
My pleasure.